All right, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining us. Sorry, we started a couple of minutes late. So my name is Lina Al-Arian. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. We were founded in 2010, and our mission is to defend the civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair U.S. criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners in the U.S. targeted in the so-called War on Terror. This is episode 30 of our Injustice at Home webinar series. To watch past episodes on topics such as the unjust prosecution of the Fort Dix Five, COINTELPRO in the case of Jalil Muntaqim, in our last episode on Palestine and the War on Terror, visit our video section of our Facebook page or visit our YouTube channel at Civil Freedoms, where you can subscribe. Be sure to follow us on social media for updates on our work and notifications of future episodes and virtual events. Today, I'm honored to be joined by four wonderful guests who will be discussing the recent Project South report, Spying on the Margins, the History, Law, and Practice of U.S. Surveillance Against Black, Muslim, and Immigrant Communities and Contemporary Strategies of Resistance. Project South has been around for 35 years and was founded as the Institute to Eliminate Poverty and Genocide. Rooted in the legacy of the Southern Freedom Movement, their mission is to cultivate strong social movements in the South, powerful enough to tackle complicated social, economic, and political problems. I'm very glad to introduce our four speakers. The first one, Azadeh Shahshahani, the Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South. Azadeh has worked for a number of years in the U.S. South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She previously served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and as National Security Immigrants' Rights Project Director with the ACLU of Georgia. Azadeh serves on the Advisory Council of the American Association of Jurists and on the Board of Directors of Defending Rights and Dissent. She has published numerous reports and articles in various media outlets and won several awards. In 2017, she was chosen by Georgia Trend magazine as one of the 40 under 40 notable Georgians. Azadeh will share with us a little bit about her organization and will discuss the situation of government surveillance in the Georgia area and why she felt it was important to publish a report on this topic. Next, you'll hear from CCF staff attorney Amit Gupta, whom we had the honor of meeting while he was a legal fellow and researcher at Project South. He is the lead author of this extensive and truly impressive report and will walk us through it. He shared with us some resources as well, which we hope will be dropping into the chat. Amit led a workshop on the topic of surveillance at our CCF Family Conference in 2019. Amit has gone on to represent a number of our political prisoners in compassionate release motions and other petitions, and helped 2 prisoners go home to their families, including Sami Hassoun, who's here with us today from Lebanon. Sami had already served 10 years out of a harsh 23-year sentence for a fake, quote-unquote, terror plot manufactured by the FBI. Sami was released and deported to Lebanon last year. In the judge's order to release, he observed that the alleged crime for which Sami was convicted, quote, was encouraged by undercover law enforcement agents, end quote, and that he, quote, never posed an actual threat to the public, end quote. Today is a treat for the CCF family since it's the first time attorney and client are able to gather together after his release. Inshallah, next time in person. Sami, of course, has a lot to share about his experience as a target of entrapment and surveillance, the impact it's had on him and his family, both then and now. Finally, we'll be hearing from my mom, my personal hero, Nahla Al-Arian, a tireless champion of civil and human rights who campaigned for freedom for both her brother, Mazen al-Najjar, who was held under the use of secret evidence for over 5 years in the United States, and later her husband and my father, Sami Al-Arian, all while pursuing higher education, volunteering in the community, teaching and mentoring Muslim youths, and raising 5 children. My mom is literally the face of government surveillance, gracing the cover of Project South's report after having been spied on for most of her adult life. You'll be hearing from her later in the discussion about her and our family's experience of being targeted in a politically motivated investigation and later prosecution. 2 final announcements. Please be sure to drop your questions in either the Facebook or Zoom chat, which we'll get to during Q&A at the end. And finally, if you're inspired or even outraged by any of what you hear today, please consider splitting a donation between our 2 organizations on this Blessed Friday, Project South, and of course CCF. We'll put those links in the chat for you as well as the link to the full report, which I highly recommend you read and share. Without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to you, Azadeh.
Thank you so much, Lina, and thank you to the Coalition for Civil Freedoms for organizing this event. Truly honored, and I should say I'm a huge fan of you all's work. It's truly inspiring, so thank you all for doing the work that you do. So as Lina stated, my name is Azadeh Shahshahani, Legal and Advocacy Director with Project South. We are a social justice organization based in Atlanta, and we work with grassroots organizations and Black immigrant and Muslim communities in the US South. And we're also in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities in the Global South. Project South is a movement building organization as well as a movement support organization. And we are also an abolitionist organization, meaning that we are aiming for the really the abolition of prisons and the criminal legal system in the US, and aiming for alternative systems of community support and community accountability. So why we did this report, there are several reasons, and I'm gonna go through them, and Amit is gonna actually cover what was in the report in terms of what, what our documentation work uncovered. So, as an organization rooted in the Black radical traditions of the US South, and as an organization that is Black-led, in terms of surveillance, we felt that we need to learn from what happened before. Obviously, surveillance is nothing new. US government surveillance is nothing new. It's not like, Muslim communities are the first ones being surveilled by the US government. And so on that, I keep remembering a conversation that happened many years ago, maybe, about 15 years ago at a mosque in North Carolina, actually, which is where I was at the time, where I was there to do a Know Your Rights presentation. And afterwards, a member of the community raised their hands. This is an immigrant member of the community. And this is, relatively shortly after 9/11, maybe, 3 or 4 years. And he was saying, why is this happening to us? Why are we being surveilled? Why are we being targeted? We are good people. And then a Black Muslim, also, a fellow member of the mosque raised his hand and said, no, you're not, absolutely not the first ones being targeted by the US government. Look at us, Black communities were subjected to surveillance for many decades before. And the way that we approached this was not to just, stay silent, but by fighting back. And so, we felt that it's really important for us to learn not only what happened in terms of, COINTELPRO, which is, discussed at length in the report, and the various other means of, the FBI and US government surveillance of Black communities and anybody engaging in any type of dissent in the 1960s, etc. But also, how did folks resist? So how did our elders resist in light of the really repressive state apparatus that they were confronting? And so on that note, Project South actually had a webinar on learning from the elders. And these were Black elders in the US South who had been subjected to COINTELPRO in terms of the strategies that they used to be able to sustain themselves and the movement and not to fracture. And so for anyone who's interested, drop me a note and I see if I can get you all a recording of it. And secondly, in terms of why we decided to do this report is because we need to learn what is happening, because knowledge is power. So, many of us, Muslim folks in particular, know that the US government is engaging in surveillance against our communities. We know that by lived experience. We know that the FBI in particular has the community under a stage of siege, is almost, what it feels like. And so, I know that because of, a personal experience in terms of, ICE monitoring my social media account. So last year in April, when there was a hunger strike at a really notorious immigration detention center here called the Stewart Detention Center. And I posted a tweet about that, there is a hunger strike happening. Hundreds of people are engaged in a hunger strike. Within an hour, I received an email from a local ICE officer demanding that I remove the tweet. This had never happened to me before. I mean, obviously I knew that, as somebody doing human rights work, my, social media accounts and otherwise are being surveilled on a daily basis by the US government, but nobody from the US government had ever demanded that I, remove something that I posted, which obviously is in direct contravention of my free speech. And so obviously we didn't pay that, any heed at all. But, the question that keeps going through my mind is, if, instead of like, I'm a lawyer, I'm part of an organization, I have a supporter structure, so I didn't feel any need, and I knew that this demand was, likely unconstitutional. And so, they couldn't support it in any way, shape, or form. So I didn't bother to, do what he had asked me to do. But if the same sort of demand had been directed to an undocumented immigrant who wasn't necessarily part of a support infrastructure, just imagine how frightening that is coming from ICE. And we know that, other staff people from Project South have been subjected to surveillance, because of their organizing work. They have been approached by the FBI. And they have the demands that have been posed to them, just being subjected to an interview and all of that. We also know that this is happening to community members in terms of the FBI in particular, going to people's houses. People don't know how to respond, and I would say especially immigrant folks do not know how to respond when the FBI comes to your door. There is an assumption, I should say, among many community members that when a figure of authority approaches you, you should talk to them because that's what you have to do. And obviously the FBI does not explain to people that you have the right to an attorney or you don't have to consent to this interview, etc. So there is this assumption that I do have to take part in this interview. And oftentimes, the FBI are trained very much so in terms of couching it in terms of, well, we know you didn't do anything wrong. This is just a friendly conversation and, just talk to us and then, we won't be bothering you anymore, which we know is wrong. You talk to the FBI once, you have just opened the door to them coming back to your work again and again, or house again and again and again. And so, oftentimes, I would only learn about the FBI approaching people for an interview after I had already gone to a mosque, done a Know Your Rights presentation and established a level of trust. And then it was afterwards that people would approach me and say, oh, by the way, last week the FBI came to my house and they just wanted to do an interview. And of course I talked to them, but they're coming back next week. What should I do? And then, in terms of just, ongoing surveillance of community members, we have seen various cases of, for example, a young man, a US citizen, being approached by a local cop in his driveway, being interrogated for half an hour purely about his political beliefs. Asking him questions like, do you prefer Malcolm X or Martin Luther King? And so we agreed to represent this young man. And I called the local cop and I'm like, what did you want to talk to him about? And he's like, well, we're just, doing an outreach program. And I mean, this type of surveillance, obviously, and really harassment by law enforcement has very specific consequences. So for example, this young man was put in a position that he had to engage in self-censorship afterwards because, he was in a position that, he was seeking a career, higher education. And so, he felt that now that he knew that his, social media was being surveyed by law enforcement very actively, if he were going to put out, his political beliefs, that would have really serious repercussions for him. And also, I've been kind of representing people in terms of encounters with the FBI for a long time, pretty much since 2005 or so. And I felt in the past few years, the FBI had just got much more aggressive in terms of their approaching community members. So just one example, we were representing this refugee who had been approached by the FBI. Normally what happens in these situations is I get the FBI agent's number, after a consultation with my client. If we decide that it's not in the best interest of my client to talk to the FBI, I, as the attorney, call up the FBI and say, my client is not interested in talking to you, and that's the end of the story. In this situation, they had called from the headquarters. They had called his house. We didn't have a name in terms of who the FBI agent was. So all I had, all I could do was to show up there to the house when the FBI agents were supposed to come. And again, this is during the Trump administration, maybe about 3-4 years ago. So I show up, they come. There's huge dynamics in terms of power. Two big guys. And then there's also gender dynamics and racism dynamics, because they were refusing to believe that I'm a lawyer, that I am, as a woman and as an immigrant and as a Muslim, I can actually be this man's lawyer. Like, there was all these like xenophobic, Islamophobic, and sexist and racist assumptions on their part. So after we established that, yes, I am in fact representing this man and I am going to sit here for this interview, they were still, very aggressive in terms of their questioning. And then, they questioned him for about an hour and a half. And then a couple of weeks later, I received a call. And I was in transit, I was, traveling. And so I couldn't show up. I learned that, there were agents at my client's house. And so I called the house and I asked my client to put, one of the agents on the phone, and they're like, yeah, we are with USCIS, the agency that's in charge of like processing people's immigration papers. And I'm like, so the FBI is not there with you? And they're like, no, there's no FBI here. So the neighbors had captured photos of the agents in the house, and those same FBI agents were in fact in the house. And they had said that, when you had the lawyer there, we couldn't ask you all the questions that we wanted, so we decided to come by ourselves. Many things wrong with this picture. Obviously, they knew that I was a lawyer. They had an obligation to approach me, yet they had decided to go around me, which had never happened to me before, this type of abuse. And secondly, the USCIS agent flat out lied to me. That type of, direct and, just deliberate lie hadn't happened. So at least my experience that government agencies were becoming even more aggressive in terms of their surveillance and abusive tactics targeting community members. And then lastly, in terms of why we did this report is because, we know that this is happening. Well, how are folks resisting? There is a need for us to learn about tactics of resistance around the country. So for one thing, representation is very important. We already talked about legal representation. So there's really a huge need for community members across the country to be aware that when they're approached by law enforcement, the FBI or local cops or whoever, they need to have representation. We know of cases where youth talk to the FBI, etc., without having counsel present, and that by itself got them into trouble. So that's the message that we continue to put out to community members. Please contact Project South if you're in the U.S. South. Please contact the National Lawyers Guild. Contact other organizations. Make sure that you have an attorney present to be able to advise you in terms of how to go about these types of interactions with the FBI, etc. Secondly, in terms of how people are resisting, so unfortunately we have leaders in many mosques across the country actively inviting the FBI into the mosques, which is like hugely disappointing, and I think a topic for a whole other conversation in terms of how to resist that. But we do have resistance already happening. So as Amit mentioned in the report, we had an instance of the leaders inviting the FBI into the mosque, and then the community organizing and leading. That's really powerful. And I think that is something that folks across the country can replicate if you don't agree with the tactics of your leadership. We have localities across the country, such as San Francisco, where people are actively cutting the partnership between their local law enforcement and the FBI, so that can be replicated really across the country. And then lastly, obviously we know that Israel has perfected tactics of repression and brutality and surveillance, as we just saw, obviously, in the recent massacre of Palestinians by Israel. And those tactics of apartheid also very much rely on surveillance, and they're now exporting those tactics of repression and surveillance to various repressive countries across the world. And so law enforcement from across the country in the US are now being sent to Israel to receive that training, to come back and implement them on people of color in Atlanta, for example. So in Atlanta, obviously, we had the murder of Rayshard Brooks in South Atlanta, very close to where Project South's office is. And this Saturday is actually the 1-year anniversary of his murder by Atlanta police. And so it is essential that we end this deadly exchange between police in the US and Israel. And so on that note, I wanted to make sure folks are aware that tomorrow in Atlanta, there is a rally in front of Atlanta City Hall calling on Atlanta to go ahead and end this partnership and exchange program with Israel. And so, yeah, I know there's really powerful work happening around the country. So I look forward to hearing more from our other panelists, and definitely look forward to staying in touch with you all and continue to be inspired by all the great work that's happening. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Azada. That was brilliant. And you touched on so many important issues and so many critical linkages between all of these issues and how they intersect. Definitely, if you're in the South, continue to reach out to Project South to participate in their many important events. And even if you're not, there are a number of events that you all hold virtually that I encourage you to sign up for and register and participate in. I totally agree that I think having a discussion on the complicity of mosques and community leaders and working with federal agents and the FBI is such an important topic, and you really made me think about pursuing that as a conversation. I think there will be a lot of interest as well as resistance to this. All right, Amit, you're up, and yeah, I'm excited to hear your presentation. Thank you, Azadeh.
Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you, of course, to Azadeh, because if it hadn't been for Azadeh, I wouldn't have ever come to Atlanta. I would never have joined Project South. I would never have written this report. I would have never met anyone from CCF. I would have never become a staff attorney for CCF, and I would have never submitted the motion that eventually got our other guest out of prison. So none of this really would have happened without Azadeh and without Project South. So I really want to emphasize how appreciative I am to everyone at Project South. In addition to Azadeh, there was also Manzoor, who helped very much with the report, and also Priyanka, who's the staff attorney at Project South, and then also very important, our tech guy at Project South, Nate. He was, very vital in terms of helping me figure out some of the tech stuff, because I'm not a techie myself. And he was very important in helping us find a secure way to store information when we were doing research for this report, which obviously the last thing you want to do is do research on surveillance and then have your own research be taken by the people you're trying to challenge. And of course, everyone else at Project South as well. And of course, it's great to see everyone from CCF, and it's great. This is the first time, as Lena mentioned, that I've actually got to hear Sammy's voice, which it's a weird experience to have this very close relationship to clients and not actually be able to see them. But I think it's also one of the messed up things about prison. So I wanna go over the general gist of this report. I've prepared a resource folder. I think so. So the way basically it's not every citation that's included in this report, but it is a number of the kind of extensive pre-existing research reports, and as well as some reports from the Department of Justice Inspector General. There's reports from Human Rights Watch and other organizations, other watchdog groups. There's also a number of reports by the Brennan Center, which kind of contemporaneously to many of the aspects of the war on terrorism released their own research, which was really important in terms of putting this report together. You can also find in the chapter 2 folder, I tried to arrange the resources by chapter. There's a pretty extensive law journal article actually by Azadeh, along with Carlos Torres and Ty Tavares, which also covers a lot of the stuff. Some of the stuff that's discussed in the report. As you can see, kind of from the report itself, I think just to make sure that everyone has the link to it, it's actually on the front page of Project South. It's also in the resource folder. If you're having trouble opening it, it's a zip file, so it's a .rar file, which just means you have to decompress it. It should be, I think, for most people, that you should probably already have software on your computer that can do that. Yeah, because of the nature and the expansive scope of this report, we literally start from the original colonization of the Americas up until the Trump administration. It's difficult, even with a lengthy report like this. It came out to the original version before formatting is about 90 something pages. I had to be selective about what I focused in on, so I tried to make each part of the report as comprehensive as possible. So because of the time limits, I'm not going to go over everything in here, but I am going to try to hit the major points of the report and kind of what I think people should be able to take away from this report. So to begin with, I think there's a lot of talk about, as Azadeh mentioned, there's a belief among some people in the Muslim community that all of the anti-Muslim aspects of the surveillance campaign and the war on terrorism and so on, that this is new, and this is something that started after 9/11. But as I kind of try to point out in the report, not only surveillance itself, but the belief that Muslims specifically are a sort of threat actually goes to the earliest days of the country's founding. Except the Muslims in question that were imagined as this threat were not primarily Arab and Middle Eastern people. They were, of course, the earliest Muslims that lived in the continental United States, who were enslaved Africans. And not only were they viewed as a threat because of the general Orientalist, belief that Islam is a dangerous religion and so on, but based on the fact that many of these enslaved Africans were willing to resist, that they were willing to resist their oppression as slaves, that they were willing to very aggressively demand abolition. And some of them, particularly given that some of the Muslim communities that were human trafficked to America were involved in trade, and as a result, many of their members were literate, which was not always true of the white men that quote unquote owned them. So as a result of that, sometimes you had situations where, as a result of having this advanced form of knowledge of being literate, that enslaved Muslims were able to achieve significant influence in the country, even during the slave days, in the days of slavery. So the reality though was the U.S., like Europe before it, had adopted a number of just xenophobic and immigration rules that for a long time anyone who was considered Muslim was not allowed to be naturalized as a U.S. citizen, and that was presumptively applied to anyone who came from any country that was associated with Islam, which included all of the Mediterranean countries. This would continue well through the 20th century. During the 20th century, the fears that the U.S. Had of Muslims involved viewing both the Black Muslim community in the U.S. as well as immigrants from other countries, forming these kinds of grassroots community coalitions to do not only service work but also be involved in politics and grassroots advocacy. And at the same time that the early surveillance state began crushing the labor movement and the anti-war movement, these early Muslim collaborative Muslim communities of the early 20th century were also just totally destroyed and ravaged by surveillance. This would extend through the 1940s when the FBI believed, without any basis, that Black Muslim organizations, including the Nation of Islam, were somehow collaborating with Japan during World War II. And they began something called the Raycon investigation, in which basically the idea was that any Muslim community that did anything more than just purely praying, any Muslim community that had political views of pretty much any kind, was portrayed as a potential threat. And then that extends through the modern era, when the supposed dangerous Muslim threat started to take on a more Arab and Asian association after the after the Iranian hostage crisis and the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But of course, and as I'm going to try to discuss, these events would slowly chip away at many of the reforms to surveillance that were accomplished in the intervening years, but it wouldn't really take off until after 9/11. So in terms of the actual surveillance state itself, the earliest practices of surveillance involved trying to map out the territory of the continental United States for the purpose of colonizing it, as well as the process of containing and watching and surveilling early enslaved peoples. However, these processes, as much as they are all forms of surveillance, were not systematized and top down, and the tactics that were used were not really systematized until the early part of the 20th century. So that really is the result of two specific events. One is the systematic repression of the industrial labor movement. This was spearheaded by groups like the Pinkertons and other police agencies that were active in not only providing newfound methods of security, but who were involved in actually sabotaging the labor movement, falsely accusing people of crimes, engaging in provocation, using other kind of previously unknown methods of taking advantage of the industrial processes themselves and using them to actually spy on people who are involved in labor. The other big development was that the U.S. became not only a colonial power but an imperial power with the invasion and occupation of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. And at that point, what the U.S. government began doing was applying surveillance and counterinsurgency tactics to a people that they did not have to formally recognize as citizens, which meant that they were allowed to use these industrial labor surveillance tactics through agencies of the government against an entire nation of people. Now, there's a historian, Alfred McCoy, who wrote America's Policing America's Empire, I believe it's called. It's included in the resources. But essentially, he discusses in very great detail this process by which individual tactics that were used against people in the Philippines in order to crush their resistance to the American occupation were slowly brought back into the domestic U.S. And used against Americans. So this process kind of took off and became clearest during the First World War. The U.S. government passed a series of laws permitting things like surveilling people's mail, policing speech, engaging in all different types of abuses of the law primarily against people who were opposed to the U.S. entry into the war, including leftist organizations. But it was in the aftermath of the war that probably one of the greatest abuses of the early surveillance state took place, and that was the Palmer raids. During the Palmer raids, the newly created Bureau of Investigation, as it was called back then, it was before it was called the FBI, and its General Intelligence Division, also known as its Radical Division, carried out a series of raids in which thousands of people, the vast majority of them immigrants from communities perceived to be radical, mostly Eastern European leftist communities, were just rounded up and deported. And at the same time, the same Bureau of Investigation began not only abusing its authority against immigrants and people that live in the United States, but also against political opponents of the presidential administration in that time. So in 1924, the Attorney General asked the President, Calvin Coolidge, to actually abolish the General Intelligence Division and strictly limit what the Bureau's activities to investigating specific crimes. And officially they said, okay, that's what we'll do. And then privately, they just kept doing the same thing. So, and at the same time, it's worth noting that the laws at this time were not particularly updated for the times. So, for example, back in 1928, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Olmstead that it was not a violation of the Fourth Amendment for the government to wiretap a person if they didn't have to physically trespass into that person's property. So, for example, if you listen into the next room by putting a glass against the wall, that doesn't count as a trespass. That doesn't count as doing something as intervening in someone's property interest. So therefore, it doesn't count as unlawful wiretapping. So, given the legal setup at the time, the Bureau had an enormous amount of power. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States passed what was called the National Security Act, which created the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency was created a few years later. At the same time, in the mid-60s, the Supreme Court started making rules that would slowly, curtail the legal authority, if not the actual authority of the government to engage in mass surveillance. But nonetheless, because these programs largely took place secretly without anyone even knowing they were happening, they often engaged with the courts. So, of course, the most notorious of those examples is the COINTELPRO program, which lasted for decades and actually was preceded other independent investigations that used largely the same tactics. A lot of people have heard about the COINTELPRO investigations. They know that it's notorious, but people don't really know what specifically the FBI did. So I just want to briefly go over what that was. So in 1976, Congress actually released a series of investigatory reports on exactly what the FBI did. The only reason anyone found out what the FBI did was because a group of anti-war activists broke into the FBI offices in 1971 illegally and released all of these reports to the press. But the Congress put together a committee to investigate these surveillance practices called the Church Committee. And just to discuss some of the stuff that they did, in its summary, the Church Committee says The government has often undertaken the secret surveillance of citizens on the basis of their political beliefs, even when those beliefs pose no threat of violence or legal acts on behalf of a hostile power. The government operating primarily through secret informants, but also using intrusive techniques such as wiretaps, microphone bugs, surreptitious mail openings, and break-ins, has swept in vast amounts of information about the personal lives, views, and associations of American citizens. And in terms of what that looked like, I should note also before I go on that the committee also addressed the fact that it wasn't just the FBI. These newly created intelligence organizations, including the CIA, had also done so. So nearly 250,000 letters were opened and photographed by the CIA between 1953 and 1973. The FBI opened 130,000 letters. 300,000 people were indexed into a CIA computer system, and files were created on over 7,000 Americans, as well as 100 different domestic groups in an operation that the CIA called Operation Chaos. And so just vast amounts of information are just being illegally obtained by multiple investigatory bodies. I should note one of those other bodies that did this was the Army itself. The Army also took part in penetrating the organizational structure of civilian groups, attended their meetings, and participated in their private and public activities. It included things like taking over a Halloween party, a church, a festival, and going to all of these different places to monitor these organizations for the purpose of trying to find what they internally described as dissidents. They pretended to be students at Black Studies classes at NYU. They would just photograph people in all of these places. Sometimes they would pretend to be news reporters. And so among the people that were spied on, it includes Martin Luther King, Arlo Guthrie, Jesse Jackson, just significant, Adlai Stevenson, just a significant number of pretty prominent civilian members of the society. And so other specific COINTELPRO tactics that we used by the FBI included anonymously attacking political beliefs of targets in order to get their employers to fire them. So just sending a letter to someone's employer being like, your employee's a communist. Anonymously mailing letters to the spouses of some of these targets just to make them think that they're being cheated on, just so you can ruin someone's marriage. Obtaining tax returns for specific targets and then trying to provoke an IRS investigation. Anonymously labeling informants to be members of groups known to be violent, so that other people will believe, oh, this person's violent, I better, hit them first, and things like that. They would also use misinformation. So, for example, they would send out letters or statements, or even like take over the radio frequency, of activist organizers. And send a message saying, "Hey, everybody, the demonstration's canceled. Never mind, we all have to go home." So things like that. Of course, although some of those things sound like petty and manipulative behaviors, they were very effective in destroying community organizing. But of course, that's not the most egregious thing that they did. One of the most egregious things that were noted by the committee was that the FBI actually provided surveillance of the apartment in which Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were sleeping to the Chicago Police Department, who then used that information in order to carry out a raid in which they executed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. They also, again, as I mentioned, they targeted Martin Luther King. They targeted the New Left. They were they also targeted pretty systematically the Nation of Islam. Okay. So this prompted a series of limited reforms. I go into more detail about it in the report, but kind of one of the primary reforms was in order to basically prevent Congress from putting together a series of laws to regulate the FBI. The Attorney General, Edward Levy, he put together a series of guidelines that would guide all FBI investigations in order to reassure the public. But kind of slowly over the course of many years, those guidelines would be weakened. And there was also some indication that regardless of who they were investigating, the FBI wasn't exactly following the guidelines in the first place. One example of that is how they systematically targeted an organization called CISPES. Now, CISPES was the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. So this is the kind of mostly lefty and church groups based in the U.S. that were opposed to the U.S. support for the brutal dictatorship in El Salvador. And the internal FBI memos reaffirm and reassure, almost like lip service, that they would never target U.S. citizens based on their political views. But when they described why they were surveilling specific members of CISPES, the only thing that would come up was their political views. So there was no practical way for the FBI to distinguish between a lawful investigation into what they believed was a foreign agent and simply investigating someone's political views. So eventually, when this was made known to at least some members of Congress, there was a limited efforts to actually restrict FBI spying in cases where there was, and essentially requiring that a person's political views play no part in initiating an investigation. Unfortunately, that only lasted for a few months. And in the aftermath of both the Oklahoma City bombing and the first World Trade Center bombing, Congress passed a law called ADEPA, which, among other things, basically got rid of that restriction on the FBI and also created a list of what they called foreign terrorist organizations. So this was the formalization of the process by which groups of people, rather than specific acts, would be associated with terrorism and subjected, at least for foreign terrorist organizations, subjected to a series of restrictions in terms of their interactions with U.S. citizens. At the same time, they also passed a law called IRA, which stripped federal courts of jurisdiction to review certain, to consider certain arguments and challenging deportation orders, including things like First Amendment claims, which effectively meant that they were basically creating the legal framework in which they could start targeting particularly immigrants for their First Amendment views, insofar as they tried to associate those views with terrorism or foreign terrorist organizations. And it became very difficult to challenge those because Congress had actually said, well, the federal courts aren't allowed to consider those arguments. I should also mention around the same time, the Clinton administration began a small program of rendering quote unquote terrorism suspects to other countries to face investigation. So individuals convicted in absentia of terrorism in the United States could be rendered either to the United States or to cooperating countries by the CIA. And so that included sending them to countries where there was not even going to be a trial or any meaningful process whatsoever, and a number of people were basically disappeared. So that takes us through the kind of history of the surveillance state until the war on terrorism. So in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. began implementing a series of policies that, while they were portrayed as a response to the terrorist attack, were really just a drastic expansion of policies that had already been implemented before them. So one thing to note is that the Bush administration began what they called a global war on terrorism. Now, when people first heard that, they thought it was a slogan like the war on poverty or the war on drugs. But then they started to actually try to claim the authorities that governments normally claim during war in their effort to target people and arrest people and even kill people almost anywhere in the world. So there are some articles that I've included in chapter 2 of the resources that kind of discuss this, specifically the Mary Ellen O'Connell's report on the legal case against the global war on terror, which kind of does a pretty good job explaining the legal absurdity behind trying to treat what's basically a campaign of very aggressive law enforcement as if it's war. But nonetheless, in this process of kind of using domestic criminal and intelligence policies to carry out this war, a number of different things took place. So the first thing that happened was that on 9/11 itself, the government just began a mass roundup of immigrants from Muslim countries based on virtually any irregularity, held them in detention for many months, totally denigrated them, and then deported some of them to their deaths. And although these mass arrests took place in a moment of crisis, the policies that the Bush administration would adopt in terms of immigration following that weren't all that different. So for a while, the Bush administration implemented a policy called the End Sears program. Again, there's a great report on this in the resources. It's CHRG AALDEF, Under the Radar. So this is a report by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice by Smita Narula about exactly the way in which these anti-Muslim immigration policies would be used to harass Muslim communities. So, for example, under this program, all non-citizen men and boys from 26 different countries, 25 of which were Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries, would be subjected to all kinds of additional immigration restrictions, including when they could and when and even where they could enter and exit the country. And if they didn't comply or screwed it up, they could be deported or jailed. The FBI also started getting involved in all sorts of immigration hearings in order to prejudice the immigration hearings by adding terrorism accusations, even where the person accused had no meaningful opportunity to challenge the accusation, and other things like that. So this is kind of the adoption of what would become known as the preventative policing model, which basically is premised on the notion that Muslims in general are automatically sort of predisposed to engaging in terrorism. And so therefore, the government needs to intervene before the terrorism happens, as opposed to waiting until after the terrorist attack and moving in. And this preventative policing model is based on this very anti-Muslim thesis called the radicalization thesis. So this thesis basically says that various aspects of just being a Muslim person are indicators that a person is slowly becoming a dangerous threat to the United States. Now, this is a common theme. This is, again, the same thing that happened during World War II with the Raycon investigation, that where without any real empirical basis whatsoever, just normal signs of being a Muslim person are a potential threat. And so there's actually no empirical basis to this model, but the kinds of things that the FBI would mark down as signs that somebody's a potentially dangerous Muslim would be if a Muslim person starts wearing traditional Muslim attire, growing facial hair, frequently attending a mosque, traveling to a Muslim country, or increased activity in a pro-Muslim social group or political cause. So pretty much just being Muslim, basically, is what they're talking about. So it's there's another report in the resources from the Brennan Center called Countering Violent Extremism. The report focuses on another aspect of the preventative policing model, which is these bizarre surveillance initiatives called Countering Violent Extremism initiatives, which were primarily sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security, although other government agencies, especially including at the local level and state level, have begun adopting them. Essentially, the basic idea is you can see this dangerous radicalization process taking place in young Muslim men, and you need to intervene before it gets too bad. So here's some money from the Department of Homeland Security. In exchange for this money to use on community outreach stuff, you can also basically surveil the people who show up at these various community programs and turn the information over to the Department of Homeland Security. So that report is the Brennan Center's Countering Violent Extremism report, which goes into greater depth about that. At the same time that this model was being adopted and these laws were being changed, the government began using exactly the same tactics that they once used under the COINTELPRO program. So that includes just a massive number of informants. It's worth noting that during the COINTELPRO period, the actual number of FBI informants, even if the program was very aggressive, was a fraction of the number of FBI agents that were employed once the war on terrorism was implemented. In addition, because the FBI controls its own guidelines, or the Attorney General really controls its own guidelines, after September 11th attack, the same pattern of just continually slowly getting rid of restrictions inside these guidelines were removed. And essentially what happened was that the FBI, in addition to just having thousands and thousands of potential informants, as well as citizens who agreed to serve as informants, either in exchange for money or in exchange for immigration benefits or immigration for something else, benefits of some other kind, the FBI basically created this massive number of informants that go into pretty much any public place, including mosques. Some of these informants and information processes are explicitly based on programs of racial and ethnic mapping. So the Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide, which is the part of the guidelines that governs over domestic surveillance within the FBI, much of which is still secret, explicitly states that there are times where quote unquote specific and relevant ethnic and racial behavior could be used as indicators that there's a relevant reason to investigate terrorism. And so that this became an excuse to send really FBI agents, or to at least to permit FBI agents to pretty much enter almost any Muslim community in space. But in addition, because the guidelines are very weak in terms of preventing entrapment, and because the process is assumed that there are individuals who are Muslim who are just predisposed to engaging in crime, oftentimes these informants would engage in the process of behaving as agents provocateur, where they would actually set up these extensive bomb plots and terrorist plots and other plots and just kind of manipulate or rope young Muslim people into joining them. So, I mean, some of the most egregious examples of that, are another CCF family member, Shahawar Siraj. This is a young guy, probably 17 at the time. He gets approached by, in that case, it was an NYPD informant who claims to be a member of Al Qaeda or some kind of similar group, basically intimidates Shahawar into joining a plot to blow up. I think it was the train. And when he doesn't want to do it, and he doesn't want to go along with it, he would start the actual police agent would start showing him videos and pictures of people being abused and detained in Palestine or in Iraq, just to make him angry, just to purposely radicalize him so that he could subsequently be prosecuted. And of course, it was I think Sami is going to talk about his own experience. There's basically something very similar happened to him. In another instance that was particularly egregious, called the Fort Fix 5 case, the FBI agents would just constantly goad these young Muslim men into adopting extreme views and try to get them to agree with all kinds of Al Qaeda rhetoric and all kinds of very, very strong political views. And those recordings were used at trial in order to convict them, even though the FBI agents themselves agreed that some of those men, at least, didn't even know about the underlying alleged plots that they were convicted of to attack an army base. So basically, consistently, individuals who show no real predisposition, apart from being Muslim men, are aggressively pushed into into agreeing to conduct that could then subsequently be used to justify prosecuting them. And kind of in the next section, I want to emphasize exactly what that conduct is, because it's one thing to accuse somebody of being part of a bomb plot, but because of the drastic expansion of counterterrorism laws after 9/11 specifically, it became increasingly possible to nab somebody even for when they haven't really done anything at all. And so, I mean, this is covered in the section titled Criminalizing Muslim Society. Apart from the already existing process of criminalizing organizations as terrorist organizations very vaguely, the actual process of prosecuting what's called material support for these crimes became increasingly vague. So, just to give you an example, under 2339A, these prosecutions are open-ended prosecutions wherein the underlying offense is, any number of federal crimes. But underlying that is things like conspiracy to join, a federal crime. So basically, the gist of it, it's discussed in more detail in one of the articles I have in the chapter 2 resources, which is George Brown's Preventative Prosecution. Is basically you can get nabbed for, say, a conspiracy to support a conspiracy to support a conspiracy. Like it basically you can get to the outer rungs of this vast conspiracy, and as a result of that, even small acts that they can argue are part of a much greater conspiracy suddenly can get you in trouble for things like material support. So that includes things like, for example, a person translating documents and them arguing that this translation is a form of expert advice or expert support to a terrorist organization. It can include things like even donating money or resources. So, for example, the Holy Land Foundation is probably the most egregious example of this. This is the largest Muslim charity in the United States at the time, a charity set up to support Palestinians that donated nothing more than humanitarian aid supplies. But according to the government, because those humanitarian aid supplies, in the process of getting to starving people in Gaza, because they went through the hands at some point of somebody known to be a member of a group that the government had designated as a foreign terrorist organization, specifically Hamas, they decided that that was enough to say that the Holy Land Foundation was essentially complicit in Hamas, or that the Holy Land Foundation, which was itself eventually designated as a terrorist entity. So essentially what you have is a process by which just normal day-to-day life, including things that are frankly commendable behavior, are treated as crimes. I think another example of that is that recently we were able to get Amina Ali from the Somali Muslim community released from prison, also on a CR on a compassionate release grounds. But that case was also egregious. I mean, that was a case where essentially, I believe about $10,000 worth of clothes was donated to struggling people in Somalia, but basically on the same premise that because the process went through an organization that the U.S. government doesn't like, that's an indicator of terrorism. So now I want how much, I don't know how much time I have, but I mean, dude, can I?
We have 2 more speakers, so.
Oh, right. But how much time do we have to?
Oh, today? Well, I'm trying to wrap up by 4, so.
Okay. So I do want to encourage everyone to actually read the report. So I'll just wrap up in about 5 minutes. Okay, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. Obviously it's a pretty extensive report, and the process is pretty extensive. I do want to emphasize that there were a lot of the focus on the report that I didn't cover today includes things like torture. It includes the process through which data was gathered by large numbers of people, including outside the Muslim community, and the statutes and process through which those were permitted. I also go over in chapter 3 the actual law behind the law behind these processes and why it's been difficult to challenge the law. And in chapter 5, in chapter 4 of the report, I actually also want to note We tried to cover the local processes of surveillance in each of a number of states in the South, and we noted some consistent patterns involving how state governments could not only collaborate with the federal government, but how they get around the process of avoiding anti-discrimination law. And lastly, I think the most important section of the report, which I encourage everyone to actually look at themselves, is the process of how resistance has been built to these surveillance practices. And some of them are practices from right here in Georgia. We've organized campaigns to actually shut down legislation allowing surveillance of mostly immigrant communities. As Azadeh mentioned, there are examples of where the community just ad hoc organized its own walkout when the mosque leadership tried to subject people to surveillance. And there's also some pretty extensive community organized campaigns to shut down CVE programs and to end local collaborations with the FBI. So those are all areas where you hear people saying, "What do we do about this?" I tried to be as comprehensive as possible in exactly what the answer to that is. So I don't want to take up any more time, but yeah.
Thank you so much. No, that was great. It was a really important history. There's, of course, a lot there, and I think you showed how extensive this history goes back, and that these abuses and tactics did not, in fact, start after 9/11, but pretty much as old as this country. Thank you, Amit, and I really want to have Sammy tell his story. I know you wrote a chapter or a section on entrapment and surveillance, so we'd love to hear from Sammy to talk about his case. Sammy, welcome. Oh, and I wanted to add also, mashallah, I just wanted to add that also I forgot to mention when I introduced you that you also completed your education while in prison, and it's really impressive. I think you graduated from OSU, right? The Ohio.
Ohio University. Ohio University.
Okay, great. So anyway, I wanted to just give you props for doing that because your family was so proud of you. So, yeah. All right, go for it.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank Azadeh and Amit for the report that they did and for bringing awareness. And I want to thank the CCF family for everything they've done for me. I've never had a chance to personally thank you all live like this. So thank you for everything. And Amit, thank you for writing the winning motion that got me home. And also a special thanks to Kathy, who worked tirelessly with me, and Mel, who was always in touch with me and advocated for me day and night. So thank you all for everything you've done for me and my family and for bringing me home. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna keep this short, and I'm gonna focus a little bit about the surveillance tactics that were used against me, which I didn't know were used against me until I got arrested and actually saw the evidences. And then I started reminiscing back about, wow, this happened, this happened, this happened. These were all surveillance tactics. At the moment, it wasn't clicking. I wasn't aware of that stuff. So I was 21 when I was targeted by the FBI. Till today, I don't know why. They haven't answered that question. Even when the judge raised the question and my attorneys raised the question in court of how did Sammy Hassoun become a subject or a target of investigation, the only response they said was for undisclosed reasons. And that's where they ended it. And they didn't go any deeper in that. And what confused the judge and even me is that I wasn't the type of person living an Islamic life. I mean, I'm ashamed to say this, but I wasn't the type of guy to go to the mosque. There wasn't anything that I did was a red flag or would bring any attention. So for me to even come on the map, especially with a crime like this, all right? So what has happened is that the feds claimed that I was under investigation. My investigation started 3 months prior to my arrest. But when I look at the evidences, it actually started way before that, because some of the recordings that they had and some of the tapes that they brought up were way before that time. It was like actually almost a year prior to that, to my arrest. So what happened is I was introduced to some confidential informants who portrayed to be my friends and portrayed to be father figures to me, who supported me because I was an immigrant. I was still new to the US. I was fresh. And they gave me support financially, mentally, emotionally. They showed me around. So they gained my trust. And this man, his name is Nadim, he was like a father figure to me, and I really trusted him. And he was part of something called the Assyrian Mafia in Chicago. So coming as an immigrant and only working a few hours a week and barely making any money, he gives you the prospect of a lavish life if you get involved in these activities with him. You know, I fell into that trap of that luxurious lifestyle. So make a long story short, he won my trust, and one thing led to another, and according to the FBI, my investigation started based off a drug investigation. And then somehow it flipped into a terrorism investigation. So how that happened, we still don't know how that happened. You know, so it's a lot of unanswered questions of what happened. But now that I think of, in 2009, I flew to New York and I went on a vacation with a friend. And when I got to the airport, I was checking in, and next thing you know, I was escorted by two guys to the side. And they're like, yo, we have to question you a little bit. I'm like, for what? They're like, just why are you going to New York? Simple question, simple routine. I thought it was simple. That's the first time I fly in state. So then they gave me a boarding pass with 4 S's on it. And I'm like, what is this 4 S's? So when the lady saw the 4 S's, she's like, oh no, you come from here. Everybody else go from here. You come from this line. So I went to the other line and I was strip searched. My shoes were detached from each other like this. They pulled me to the machine multiple times, and the whole time I'm like, for what? I didn't know that at that time I was being surveilled. You know, I didn't know, because at that time I just barely met this confidential informant, and no subject of a bomb plot or anything actually came up yet. So for this to happen, so that's one way. Another time, I was walking down the streets of Chicago and I had a Lebanese flag on me. It was the Independence Day for Lebanon, and a Dutch stops by with 4 guys come out and like, yo, why you have a Lebanese flag on? And I'm like, it's my independence. I'm just walking with it. It's no big deal. So they took me and were questioning me on the corner, and they showed me a badge. And I'm like, dude, it's no big deal. But again, these were showing me that I was being surveilled at that time. But I didn't know. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I was like, it's normal, you know. I don't know what's going on. One time while I was at work, we had this guy in front of the shop. The third time we see him, he's taking pictures of the shop. So one of my coworkers approached him. And when he got there, the guy flashed the badge at him and drove off. So when I got arrested and I saw all the evidences that came to me, all the tapes that came to me and all the evidences, this is how I started finding out that I was being surveilled and monitored. Am I cutting up?
Yeah, a little bit. Your screen froze, I think. All right, well, until he comes back, I guess, I'm not sure his technical situation. I just want to add something about Sammy, is that his family kept saying how nice of a person he is, his mother and his brother, that he's the best person that they know. And then when we announced that he was getting released, we received a number of letters from other prisoners who interacted with him in various prisons throughout the country. Of course, they get moved so often, and they all said the same thing and expressed how happy they were for him, and said he's just one of the nicest people they ever met. So it's sad that they go after such good people.
I do know one of the outrageous parts about what happened to Sammy was that every time they tried to coax him into this ridiculous plot, he would say and advocate for stuff that made the plot less bad. Like
that's right. Yes.
Keep saying things like, "Why don't we plant a bomb somewhere?" And he's like, "Well, why? If you want to start, some problems, why don't you just use smoke bombs? That way, no one gets hurt." And they were like, "No. We need to have real bombs." And so purposely try to manipulate. Oh, he's back.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
that's a really good.
Sorry,
no, we're glad to have
the
you
connection
back.
went out.
Yeah, no problem. Go for it.
Okay, so as I was saying, so whenever I got my surveillance tapes, the evidence they were going to use against me in the court, I found out that my car was bugged. My car was bugged. My mom's car was bugged. My room was bugged. My computer was hacked. My phone, they had everything. They had recordings of me having dinner at home. They had recordings of me sleeping. They had recordings of me speaking on the phone in my room. They had recordings of me in the car. I mean, video and audio, not just audio, you know? So I was like, wow. And everything was being watched, you know? I was like on the total surveillance. I was pretty shocked. And then come to find out too that a girl I was dating, apparently dating at that time, she was a confidential informant too, was sent by the FBI to date me, you know? And I was like, wow, she is a CI too? This is nuts, you know? And one time I started thinking about like, how did I pay attention to that? And I was blind to it because one time I was in her house, I was sleeping over and I was on the computer, I was trying to use the internet. I saw a file with my name on it. So I clicked on it, it had a password. So I'm like, why do you have a file with my name on the password? She's like, oh no, this is just our memories together. I'm writing them down. So at that time, I just didn't think about it. But now that I found out she was a confidential informant, I'm like, wow, the whole time she was just like probably logging everything about me. And I don't know, you know? So from every corner, from the girl I dated to the guy I looked at as my best friend or father figure, from guys working with me at work, you know? So everybody was like, I was like, man, I'm not that important. I'm not that big of it. That wasn't even a threat. You know, I might have sold a few illegal items in the streets, but it was nothing to do with terrorism. And every time a bomb plot would come up, I would be like, yo, I don't want to kill nobody, man. Let's try something else, you know? So, and then the push towards the bomb plot, I'm like, okay, well, let's try this. One thing I want to make people aware of that they're not aware of, that this surveillance thing extends to prisons. It's not just outside. So when I got incarcerated, when I would send an email out, it would take 3 days for the email to get to my family, another 3 days for the email to come back to me. And when I go ask for these things, they're like, well, because Homeland Security said to monitor you. And I'm like, why would Homeland Security say that? So because of your case. So I was like, okay, fair enough, you know? So after I got sentenced and I went to the federal max, the USP Leavenworth, once I went there, the security increased on me, the surveillance increased on me. So the guy was like, we're gonna watch you. The security person, Sergeant Security, was like, we're gonna watch you every move in here. They have you labeled to an organization known to be by the US, the terrorist organization. I'm like, it's impossible because the judge himself admitted that I have no ties to anybody. And this case is not a case of terrorism. But because of the charge I was charged with, and because I made a threat one time about Mayor Daley, and that qualifies as a government entity. So automatically, because I threatened a government entity and the crime happened, and so they kind of correlated the whole thing together. So that made it a crime of terrorism. You know, so the law is so broad to interpret, you know, that's how the law is written. So you can just use it as you please, basically. So I was like, okay, fair enough. So I was like, so I went and got my court documents and I showed it to him. So he makes a copy of it and he sends it to the counterterrorism unit in San Diego saying that, well, we're reading that he has no ties to anybody. And then still, Homeland Security says, no, we have enough evidence to say he has ties to somebody. So we're going to keep the security on him and keep monitoring him. But what happens is that type of surveillance, when other inmates sees that you're subject to more pat downs in prison, your cell is being more searched. I can't use the phone as a normal inmate, so I had to fight to use the phone for 24 hours. Sometimes they used to give me a limited time to use the phone only so that they can be able to monitor me. So I have to file a cop out saying what time do I want to make a phone call so that they can monitor my phone call. So when inmates sees that, they're kind of worried to even talk to you. They're like, okay, are we going to be surveilled if we associate with you? So you become like, people are afraid to be around you in prison, you know, which is not fair. It creates suspicion between inmates inside the prison. And then they come and send this thing out to every Muslim saying that, well, know that somebody among your community works for the government. So everybody's looking at everybody, who's the one working. There might not even be anybody, but every inmate now is living in fear. And like they don't congregate for Jumu'ah prayer. If they go congregate, everybody's suspicious of the other person. There's always division in the ranks, you know. Also, what happens is if a non-Muslim becomes Muslim in prison, grows a beard, like Amit made the point, and wants to be Muslim, you know, and wears the Muslim clothes or in prison or reads the Quran too much, what happens is they take your name, they profile you in the system, and they send it out to a government, and they can't tell you, we've sent your name out. So when you go home, you become under surveillance from prison because they think you got radicalized in prison. And what happened with a white inmate that was he was Christian, became Muslim in prison. When he went home, he was approached by the FBI, and he was monitored by the FBI, and he was harassed by the FBI because of what the prison sent his name out, you know? So I was subjected to a lot of harassment in there for the first few years until people got to know me, got to really know my case, and they were like, okay, well, he's not that big of a threat. So that was good until Qasem Soleimani died. And then when he died, because of me, where I'm from in Lebanon, and what they suspected I'm tied to, they sent a report to the prison saying, increase your monitoring on Sami Hassoun because Qasem Soleimani died. What the heck I have to do with this? I don't even know the guy. Like, you know, like that doesn't make any sense. And I saw the report from Homeland Security, and I was like, wow, this is nuts. But alhamdulillah, that after that happened, you know, shortly after that, I was released from prison, you know, alhamdulillah. But the effect of surveillance is, the ripple effect of your family and friends is that even when you come home, Muslims kind of look at you like, if I talk to this guy, I'll befriend him, will I be monitored? You know, even some Lebanese guys out of prospect of traveling outside the country, you know, leave the country to immigrate somewhere, like, well, if I talk to this guy, so even family members, it's sad to say with family members, if I go to an embassy, well, they deny me a visa because I associated with this guy, you know? Or if you call their phone, be like, why are you calling me, dude? Won't you call me from your mom's phone or from your cousin's phone? And they created this fear, you know, and it creates this suspicion among each other and this fear among each other. And it's sad to say, it spreads. And people are like, they become precautious, like, so it's hard. It makes your relationships hard. It makes it hard for you to get a job. You know, it makes it hard for you to travel. So it's like, man, so I'm paying the price for the rest of my life now with everything, just because of you starting surveilling me for no reason and dragging me into a path, you know, to join something to do something that, but anyway, so inshallah, changes happen. People are more aware. Inshallah, the fear kind of like leaves a little bit, but it's sad to say that you have too many Muslims that leave the religion or don't want to be Muslim or pretend not to be Muslim, or I don't know how to say it, play with the religion just because for the sake of not being monitored, right? And unfortunately, a lot of them even actually go as far working with the government to set up other Muslims so that they can be safe, so that they can feel like they can stay in the country or have benefits, you know, and we end up paying the price for it, which is sad. I would love to speak about my case, but because of the sake of time, that's why I didn't go elaborate too much about my case. So I just shared a few things, how I surveilled and what happened. And so I want to thank you all for inviting me, and thank you all for everything you're doing.
So we'll definitely have you back. I mean, we want to, you know, we do this, you know, throughout the year. We tackle these issues in all the different dimensions and formats. So you hopefully if you're available, we'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, inshallah. Just let me know, inshallah.
But thank you.
No problem.
For addressing this. No problem. Great, and we're so glad to see you out and free.
Thank you.
All right, so next I want to first, before, and everything you said, by the way, about the fear and the stigmatization and the guilt by association, sadly applies to family members as well. And I'm sure my mom could speak a little bit to that as well with our experience. Also, people not wanting us to call them, not picking up our phone calls, and, you know, distancing themselves from us. So I'm very sorry that you had to go through that and probably continue to go through that to some extent. Before my mom begins, I wanted to play a quick clip from the documentary that was made about my family's case, USA versus Al Aryan. I know that a number of you guys have probably seen this clip already, but for the sake of the topic, I thought we should play it, and then she can begin.
Pick things out to make them whatever you want them to be.
It's anyone's guess what prompted the original wiretaps. We tried to find that out, and we were prevented from getting real information about the genesis of the wiretaps.
We had them for the trial because, you know, we've had to listen to them and even transcribe a few of them, but I mean, we're just worried who, you know, whose hands they'll end up in, so that's why we kept them, but
Yeah,
I don't want them.
anyone to have them. These are my private conversations with my friends, and I don't want.
I don't want them either.
Even
There's
that I don't want the government to keep them. To tell you the truth, these belong to us, not to the government. And the government should get rid of them if they have any sense of decency. So now, my fear is that because the jury doesn't speak Arabic, the government will take advantage of that by presenting the jury with, a translation of our conversations that isn't
You know,
accurate.
tone is everything, and for them to read a conversation like, you know, I'm going to the school today to I'm going to the school today, you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, like there's a reason for why he would go there. I mean, just changing
Like, for example,
everything.
in Arabic we say "ma'a salama" at the end of the conversation, which means be safe. So the government would say, "Be safe." It's like someone is gonna do
Right.
something scary and a crime, and be safe. You know?
Yeah.
And this is so unbelievable.
When the case first started, the government classified all of those phone conversations. The judge agreed with the defense that that wasn't a very good idea because Dr. O'Larian had a right to see the evidence against him, especially when it was his own phone conversations.
Sounds muffled.
هنا يمكن maybe.
حاولي تجربي to play another one.
السلام عليكم.
Oh my god, you sound so cute.
Hi, may I speak to Dr. Alarian, please? No. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to order a pizza, 1 medium Bigfoot. We don't have medium Bigfoot. You have only 9? Bigfoot? Yes.
What is it? I don't remember. That was a 94.
The Bigfoot one? It was the one that was big. And it was like squares, right? Squares. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
We used to get it all the time.
I would like one.
That's it. I can't listen anymore. I'm sick and tired of hearing this. It makes me so sick, you know, that they spied on us all this time. It's not
Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Mama.
1 second.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Thanks for having me here. MashaAllah, Sami explained a lot of things that are similar to what we went through. But I will, again, you know, mention some of the stuff that happened to us. Of course, as you saw in the video, we felt so angry that time, you know, we felt so stressed out knowing that they were spying on us. And it's so, like, we felt so violated, you know, our intimate time with at home with my kids, with my husband, you know, that was really horrible. But that's what big governments do to victims like us, you know, we Palestinians. We came here to America believing in the ideals, you know, freedom of speech, expression, political freedom. But unfortunately, we saw through our experience that these were just untouchable, you know, things. So the story happened. How did we find out that we were being surveilled? That's in 1994, late 1994. My husband was out of town. It was a Saturday morning, very early in the morning. A policeman showed up at our door and he asked me this weird question: why did you throw your garbage bags into the dumpster of somebody at the end of the street? And I was shocked. I said to him, my teenage son, who was in charge of taking the garbage from the garage to the front yard, you know, where it's being picked up, he is really like, you know, he finds it so hard to do this, let alone go all the way to the end of the street to put it in the dumpster of someone we do not know. So that was really an eye-opener. The policeman continued saying to me that all the bags were torn by a sharp instrument, like a knife or something. That was really very weird also. And little by little, we found out that it wasn't a foreign agent. We thought the Mossad or somebody, you know, because my husband was a political activist giving speeches about Palestine, Palestine. So we thought it was a foreign agent who was doing that. But unfortunately, we found out later that the FBI was doing this. When we bought this device to check bugs in our homes, and the device went crazy, especially when it came close to one of them. So we found out that there were at least 3 bugs. One of them was in the linen closet near our bedroom. And when a friend of ours removed it, the FBI visited him and warned him not to remove any more bugs. So we knew that it was the FBI that time. Also, during some events, like we had a fundraiser for our community school, and the waiters looked weird that time, you know, so we felt it wasn't a normal event anymore, that we were being spied on. And what else? So many stories. One of them also was that they used people coming to us all the time to talk to us about, you know, like, we support you guys and we want to be working with you. Okay, some of them were Muslims, others were like leftists. And we figured them out so easily. One of them was saying something that nobody knew but us, you know, like something private. Only people who were spying on us knew about it. So when we asked, how did you know about this? Their faces went red, you know, and they just left, never came back. So we were always approached by informants and spies, but thank God, you know, we never, because we were innocent. We just did the right thing all the time. And that's why, you know, they also sent journalists to us. And when they failed to find anything that was incriminating, they made up stories, you know, like especially a Tampa Tribune reporter in Tampa, Florida. He was writing almost every day an article about us. One day they didn't find anything to write. It was a Thanksgiving. So what did they write? Thank God you are not Sami Alarian, whose home was invaded and this and that, you know. And so we were tried on the pages of the newspapers until you know, and we were always saying to the people, you know, this is a fake trial. Let's go to a real court and you will see that we are going to be acquitted. And thank God, you know, we were acquitted because he was innocent, my husband and his co-defendants. Also, you know, because of this feeling all the time that we are under surveillance, my kids many times had nightmares. You know, we still suffer from this, you know, trauma because we felt really invaded, you know. Yeah. And they keep telling me about their homes, like somebody is looking through the glass windows and looking at them since they were young, very young. Yeah, they were children. And what else? I think that's about it, you know.
Yeah, I can mention like the person who was hired by the government to photograph my father.
Oh, yes, yeah, that's also.
You can tell it.
Oh, yeah, so what happened is that there was an FBI agent who was taking so many hundreds of pictures of my husband going into the grocery store, coming out, going to dinner with my brother, for example, or with a friend, coming out. And they brought this agent because they were really bankrupt, you know, the government in the trial. They brought this agent to show these pictures. And then at the end, our lawyer asked him, so you caught my client in the pursuit of having lunch? And the agent said, no, I believe it was dinner. So that was laughable at the time, but it was really not laughable because of, the seriousness of the charges against my husband. We also were bombarded with like 472,000 phone calls and faxes. Imagine that time with little resources, you have to look into this big number of phone calls to find the ones that are related to the ones that the government used against you. And you have to, because many phone calls explained for example, the phone call that the government used against you. So it was taking my husband a lot of effort and time, you know, and us also some money, you know, we had to pay to translate and all of that, unfortunately. So it's like really an impossible case, our case, you know, using phone calls like this, even because the government was so bankrupt, they used a dream against my husband as evidence against him. You know, a co-defendant was telling his dream to his friend on the phone, and this dream became about my husband. This dream became evidence against my husband. And my husband was telling our lawyer, like, okay, I didn't even have the dream. It was someone else, you know. So all of that shows how stupid this whole case was. And that's why, thank God, the jury looked through it and they knew. When they were asked, what made you acquit Dr. Alarian, they said there was no evidence, you know. So that's about it. Thank you so much. I don't want to keep you more.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And just to add, like, it wasn't as though they were just surveilling my father and his calls. It was literally our entire family. And from the moment that we would pick up the receiver actually on our landline, it would start recording. And we're a house full of people and 5 kids. Some of the time the phone would be knocked off the wall and it would just be off the hook for a while, and it would be recording everything that was going on in the house in addition to the bugs. So it was really our entire family under surveillance for over a decade at least. Well, let me just see if there's 2 questions that I see in the chat. One says, did the people who are used as informants against Sammy have criminal records and charges and possibly use them as informants to decrease their charges? This is directed at Sammy Hassoun.
Yes, they did. They both had criminal charges. And Nadim, one was American, Nadim was an Assyrian Iraqi. So not only did he get money and got his charges dropped, he was also promised green card and citizenship if he was able to get that. And she had her charges dropped against her.
Yeah, it's all too common, unfortunately. Either they pay them or incentivize them with money or dropping their charges. The other question, or this is a comment, and it was while you were speaking, Sammy, they were doing this in San Diego a few years back as well, targeting mostly young Black people, setting people up for fake robberies and elaborate plots, entirely concocted by agents. Not sure if they are still doing it. Unfortunately, they are still doing it, and there's cases all the time that target both Muslim Americans and Americans in the general public, including now, I guess, far right sort of, you know, white nationalist extremists who they create to be would-be terrorists, but in fact, although we don't like their views, they may not necessarily have ever carried out the plot that the government concocted. So, okay, I think now's a good time to wrap up. Thank you all for sticking with us to the end. And for those who missed it, well, I guess they're not here, but we will be emailing this out video to everybody who registered. It will live on our Facebook videos page under the Injustice at Home series page and on YouTube as well. And I want to make sure that we are able to share the resources that Amith created, because it's great to learn about it and understand the history, but it's also important to understand the strategies of how to fight back, and that's why we're here. So thank you all so much, and that's it. Take care. Bye.